Atonement. This is the Adult Forum Bible Study for March 29th. We are on the last couple chapters of Mark, so we're finishing up Mark together. And we're actually starting at Mark 15. And if you remember, we're in the middle of the Passion drama. So in this last chapter beforehand, we had Jesus have his Last Supper. He went to the Garden of Gethsemane. He was arrested. He was brought to the courtyard of the high priest. Peter denied Jesus, and that's where we left it. So we're beginning chapter 15. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests had a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, which is called the Sanhedrin. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked him, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Now there's a couple things going on here. One, in Mark, basically the Gospels never want to paint Pilate as being the one who's responsible for the death of Jesus, and that's intentional, because they want the readers to understand that it was a larger system at play within the religious world. The truth was, Pilate was known to be a pretty ruthless man. In reality, Pilate probably was not someone who was hemming and hawing and trying to get out of crucifying Jesus. He probably didn't care. And this is painting him in a way so that readers don't go, "Oh, well, it would have all been fine if Pilate hadn't." And then you would have sort of scapegoated the Romans or Pilate. But the truth is that the writers of the gospel wanted the guilt, so to speak, to fall more on the people in a larger sense. Maybe on the religious institution. Remember, we tread very, very carefully to not make this anti-Semitic. Because as I've said many, many times, when people like Jesus come and confront the powers that be, there will always be opposition in every culture, in every religion, and in every faith. So we don't want to assume this is specifically a Jewish thing. Jesus would have been killed by every religious leader of every religion he would have been born into. That's human nature. That's the point, right? Okay, got that settled. So what we do see, however, is that both Pilate, who wants to satisfy the people, is likened to Herod. So earlier, Herod had liked John the Baptist. He liked to listen to John the Baptist, and he was sort of forced to arrest John the Baptist with pressure from his wife. And then when he had this big party and the daughter danced, and he said, "Oh, I'll give you anything. What do you want?" And she says, "The head of John the Baptist on a platter." And he wanted to satisfy the crowd. He didn't want to look bad in front of his guests, so he had John the Baptist beheaded. That shows a huge lack of courage and a weakness on the part of Herod. And Pilate, in some ways, is shown to be similar. And I think what we can see from that is that sometimes you can have great power, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a good leader or that you're doing what's best on behalf of the people. So that's really important for this part of the story. I also want to notice about Barabbas. The name Barabbas in Hebrew Bar means son, bar mitzvah, bar means son, and Abbas means father. So Barabbas' name is son of the father. And he was arrested for being part of an insurrection against the Roman government. So literally you have a man, Barabbas, who's pulled out, and you have Jesus, who's being accused of treason and is called the Son of Man or the Son of God. And you have these people, one actually is the Son of God, one has the name, and one has committed the crime that Jesus is accused of but hasn't done. So Barabbas is set free and considered innocent, whereas Jesus is considered guilty. Finally, I want to notice from this part, it took me a long time to realize, because I was sort of raised with the idea that on Palm Sunday you had like all of Jerusalem outside waving palm branches and greeting Jesus. And then here they are 5 days later and they've flipped, right? They've gone from Hosanna to crucify him. That's not necessarily true. For better or for worse, if we just look at the reality and take the Bible seriously for what it says, here's what it says. There were people who were looking forward to Jesus coming because they were excited about him maybe being the king that welcomed him in on Palm Sunday. And now the chief priests and the elders are stirring up people who happen to be in the court of Pilate. We actually don't know who these people are or how many people there are there. It is the Passover. So a lot of people are going to be home with their families, focusing on that religious event. They're not all out hanging to see what kind of exciting thing might be happening in the court of Pilate. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So to this idea that I had that it was sort of all of Jerusalem pro-Jesus and all of a sudden anti-Jesus and how fickle people are isn't 100% true. The point of this part, I think, is that the Pharisees were afraid. The Pharisees were trying to push their agenda, and so they were trying to manipulate whatever they could, Pilate as well as the crowd that was present, to get Jesus to be crucified, and that they were willing to compromise letting free a man who was a violent opposer to the Roman government in the process. Okay, verse 16. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloth, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat on him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloth and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Clearly, the community of Mark knew who Alexander and Rufus were, so there's a personal connection. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Wine mixed with myrrh was a painkiller in that time. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." Now, this was meant to be a warning against treason, because the King of the Jews is stating that this man wants to usurp the throne. He wants to take over. So it is making clear that this is what this guy did and this is why he's being killed. So it was a warning sign to anyone walking by. And Golgotha was right outside the entrance of Jerusalem. So when you were going to Jerusalem for Passover, walking about your business, you had to pass these crosses with people hanging on them. Pretty gross, right? So, and then it was written above what they'd done wrong, so that you knew not to do that. So the irony is that while that was the charge against Jesus and that's why he was being killed for the Roman government, that's what we believe he really is. And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. Pretty heavy-handed. So everybody's making fun of Jesus right now, even the people suffering with him. I guess, at least you feel better that you're not, whatever. So what's interesting about this is that they say, "Come down from the cross so we may see and believe." I think you and I know if Jesus would have gotten himself down from the cross, it wouldn't have made anyone believe anything. But also it's a reminder that Jesus always used his power to empower others. He never used his power for himself. In the very beginning, when Jesus is tempted by the devil, even though Mark doesn't state what those temptations are, we read that in Matthew and Luke. The temptations indicate the temptation for Jesus to use his own power for his own gain. And he refuses that right away before his ministry begins. Well, wouldn't this be the greatest temptation, right? To get off the cross and have it done with. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." I'm going to pause again because this is interesting. A couple chapters ago, when Jesus was talking about the end times, I just heard a podcast where they said, 13, Jesus says, "Beware and keep alert, keep awake. You don't know when the master's coming back. It could be evening, midnight, cockcrow, or dawn." All of this comes at the same time, and the podcast was indicating the fact that Jesus was actually talking about what would happen when he died. That at midnight he'd be arrested. At the cockcrow, Peter would have denied him. That all of these events are happening, and now we have the sky darkened. We also see Jesus using Aramaic on the cross. "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." And I think earlier in this series, we were asking the question, did everybody understand Aramaic? Well, clearly they didn't. So whoever was here watching Jesus wasn't super familiar with Aramaic because they misunderstand Eloi for Elijah in Hebrew. They think he's crying out to Elijah to come and save him. And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." Pausing again. Everything we're reading about is super significant right now. So, first of all, the only thing Jesus says on the cross in Mark is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" or "Why have you abandoned me?" That's all he says. If you think of it from that point of view and you actually take this gospel for what it is, what Mark is trying to say is that in this moment, Jesus is terrified, and he's also maybe doubting that this is the right path, that maybe God has abandoned him. So that's pretty significant. But also then, when he dies, the temple of the Holy of Holies parts. Now, the Holy of Holies is a place where only the high priest can go after drawing straws on special occasions. If you remember our Christmas plays where Zechariah goes into the Holy Holy and he has a rope tied around his waist in case he sees God and dies, they can pull him out safely. There was that curtain, and only person could go behind it was that priest who was chosen. That's the curtain that rips in two. So God's holiest place, there's a grieving in the temple, but there's also a sense that now God's access to God, to the holiest part of God, has been opened up. Also, Remember how I said that throughout all of Mark, nobody understands who Jesus is. The disciples don't get it. Nobody gets it. The only beings that understand who Jesus are the demons. They call him the Holy One of God, and they recognize him with his power. The first time a human being says this is the Son of God is when Jesus dies. And that's Mark's whole point. Mark's entire point is we cannot fully understand Jesus and what he's about and even the heart of God without looking at that self-sacrifice on the cross. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and younger, and of Joses and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. When evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked him for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoned the centurion. He asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph brought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joses, saw where the body was laid. So we hear about Joseph of Arimathea as being a very brave man who saw something powerful in Jesus. And it must have taken a lot of courage for him to go to Pilate, because he would have been outing himself basically as someone who was compassionate towards Jesus, someone who'd just been killed for treason. So imagine how tricky that would have been for Joseph of Arimathea. And also, this seems to show how quickly Jesus died. Apparently, if someone was crucified, they could be hanging there for a very long time, a couple of days. So Pilate was a little shocked that Jesus died that quickly. And now we are at chapter 16. And I want to just point out that the Easter story is a little bit different in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark's is a very stark story. But the one thing that is the same in all four Gospels is it's Mary Magdalene. So sometimes the names of the women who are with her are different, but it's always Mary Magdalene. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they may go and anoint him. And very early, on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They'd been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Happy Easter! So that's how Mark originally ends. If you look at the oldest scrolls of Mark, you'll see it ends there. And there's a shorter ending and a longer ending that's been tagged on to Mark. And I think that is because scribes were not satisfied with that stark ending. But let's give Mark a little credit. As I said, everything in here is intentional. And I think what Mark was trying to say is that the women were absolutely terrified, that this was a complete change of everything that they knew. It was a paradigm shift about life, about who Jesus was, about what all of this meant. And it also allows us to reflect on the very, very beginning. The first line of Mark is the beginning of the good news. So this isn't the only story. This is the beginning, and the story keeps going. So the women obviously told. That's sort of the what we have to make a leap to understand is the women obviously told, because here we are, 2,000 years later, Christians. So clearly they told. Who else would have told? There is no one else who would have told. It's the women. The women are responsible for Christianity. The women are responsible for where we are today. So clearly they did tell, but this is, it's stopping abruptly for a reason, to make us think and to make us look at each other and go, so what do you think happened? So tagged onto it was a shorter ending. And all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterwards Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So that was the one edit to try to wrap it up in a nice little bow. But another scribe clearly thought, I can do better than that. So this is what another scribe wrote. Now, after he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, to whom he'd cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. Well, that sounds like the ending of John, because only in John does Jesus approach Mary alone and tell her that he's alive. After this, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Well, that sounds now like Luke with the Emmaus walk. That's only in Luke. Later, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. By using my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And if they drink anything deadly, it will not hurt them. And they will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover. And then the Lord Jesus, after he'd spoken this, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that accompanied them. Clearly someone thought this was a way better ending, that this is the way it should have been, that Jesus comes and tells the disciples how stupid they are, and then tells them they can do all these miracles, and then disappears into the right hand of God. Somehow they knew that. Wonder if they could see it. And then there are all these confirmations that what Jesus said is true. So now you don't need to doubt it all. Which is kind of annoying, because Mark intentionally left things open-ended for us, so that we would have to realize that something powerful happened for there to be a group of believers. And at least the second scribe wanted to leave nothing to doubt, and wanted to scold disbelievers and tell them they were condemned, which to me feels weird. This is also that passage of the snake handlers, that if you're faithful and you believe, you should be able to pick up a snake and hold it, and if you're bitten and then you die, well, you didn't believe well enough. But if you're bitten and you don't die, well, now you're a believer. So that's where that comes from. So all in all, Mark, 16 chapters long, barely, is a short, fast gospel that really wants us, reading it together with you, I've really gotten the impression how much in this gospel Jesus emphasizes servant leadership and empowering others, and that the role of Christianity is to serve and to pay attention to the least of the least. And so I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are and what you gained from Mark. It's different from the other Gospels. They all have their own flavor. And if you like one of the endings that was tagged on by the scribe, and what does it mean to just have the women run away and be afraid? And that's it. What do you think Mark meant by that? All right. Well, we're getting ready to enter into Holy Week, so blessings to you on this upcoming week. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.